The reconnaissance photographs arrived at Allied headquarters on the morning of March 12, 1945. Sharp, clear images taken from 20,000 feet. A bridge crossing the Rhine near Remagen. Steel girders. Concrete pilings. Railroad tracks running across its span. Everything about it screamed strategic importance. Within hours, mission planners had marked it for destruction. B-17 bombers were assigned. Coordinates calculated. Bombardiers briefed on the exact angle of approach. The bridge would be hit at dawn, cutting a critical supply route just as Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine and push into the heart of Germany. But there was a problem no one at headquarters could see from those photographs. The bridge didn't exist. Oh, the structure was real enough. You could stand on it, walk across it, even drive a truck over it if you were careful. But it wasn't the bridge. The actual railway bridge, the one carrying tons of German military equipment eastward every single day, sat 300 meters downstream, hidden in morning mist and river fog, camouflaged so expertly that Allied pilots had flown over it dozens of times without noticing. What they photographed, what they planned to destroy, was a decoy. A fake. Built in 6 weeks by a team of German engineers who'd been laughed at by their own commanders when they proposed the idea. A wooden bridge? One logistics officer had scoffed during the initial briefing. You want us to spend resources building a bridge out of timber and canvas while we're running out of steel and fuel? The chief engineer, a quiet man named Klaus Reinhardt who designed theaters in Munich before the war, simply nodded. Yes, because the enemy will believe what they want to believe. And right now they want to believe they've found a target. On March 13, 18 B-17s dropped 72,000 pounds of high-explosive ordnance on the fake bridge. The bombs fell with precision. Direct hits. The structure erupted in spectacular fashion. Timber splintering, canvas tearing, false girders collapsing into the Rhine with a visual impact that satisfied every bombardier's report. Mission accomplished. 3 kilometers away, hidden by carefully positioned smoke generators and strategic tree placement, the real bridge continued operating. Trains crossed every 4 hours. Ammunition, fuel, reinforcements, all of it flowing exactly as it had before the bombing run. The Allies wouldn't discover their mistake for another 3 weeks. This is the story of how illusion became infrastructure, how perception defeated precision, and how the most effective defense in modern warfare turned out to be something you could build with wood, paint, and an understanding of how people see what they expect to see. By early 1945, the Allies owned the sky over Western Europe. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force, had been reduced to scattered units operating with minimal fuel and dwindling pilot experience. American and British bombers flew with near impunity, hitting targets across Germany with increasing accuracy. Strategic bombing had evolved into a science. Targets were selected based on intelligence reports, reconnaissance photography, and mathematical models of industrial capacity. Every factory, every rail yard, every bridge was analyzed for its contribution to the German war effort. Then destroyed. The doctrine was simple: cut the supply lines. Prevent movement. Make it impossible for German forces to concentrate, reinforce, or retreat effectively. Bridges were particularly valuable targets. Destroying a bridge could paralyze an entire region, forcing traffic onto secondary routes where it could be attacked by fighter bombers or ground forces. But precision bombing, for all its technological sophistication, depended on accurate intelligence. And intelligence depended on perception. On interpreting photographs correctly. On distinguishing the important from the irrelevant. That's where the vulnerability lived. Klaus Reinhardt understood this better than most. Before the war, he designed stage sets for opera houses and theaters across Bavaria. His specialty was creating illusion, making audiences believe in forests that were painted canvas, castles that were wooden frames, storms that were lighting effects and sound. The goal wasn't to create something real. It was to create something believable. There's a difference. When he was conscripted into the Reich Engineering Corps in 1943, he brought that perspective with him. While other engineers focused on building stronger fortifications, Reinhardt became interested in building convincing fakes. Not for entertainment but for survival. His early experiments were crude. Wooden tanks positioned in fields to draw air attacks away from real armor. Canvas hangars placed over empty ground while actual aircraft were hidden in forests. Simple tricks. But they worked often enough to be noticed by commanders looking for any advantage in an increasingly desperate situation. By late 1944, Reinhardt had been assigned to the Western Defense Engineering Division, tasked with protecting critical infrastructure along the Rhine. The Allied advance was inevitable. Everyone knew it. The question wasn't whether the Rhine would be crossed, but when, and how much damage the Germans could inflict during the crossing. That's when Reinhardt proposed the bridge project. The real bridge was the Ludendorff Railway Bridge at Remagen, though Reinhardt's decoy operation would be applied to a similar structure near Wesel. The actual bridge had been built in 1918, designed to move troops and materials rapidly between the industrial Ruhr region and the Western Front. By 1945, it was one of the last intact crossings in the region, making it extraordinarily valuable. It was also, Reinhardt realized, extraordinarily visible. The problem with critical infrastructure is that it looks critical. A major railway bridge has certain characteristics that can't be hidden: size, position, approach roads, rail connections. From the air, it creates a distinct visual signature. Bombers could find it even in poor weather using rudimentary navigation. Reinhardt's insight was simple: if you can't hide something, create something else for them to find instead. The proposal was submitted in January 1945. Build a duplicate bridge 300 meters from the real one. Make it visually identical from the air. Same length, same apparent construction, same rail approaches. Use timber for the main structure, canvas painted to look like steel, and carefully shaped supports that would photograph as concrete pylons. The key detail: position it in a location that made more tactical sense than the real bridge. Make it slightly more visible. Slightly more obvious. Let Allied intelligence arrive at their own conclusions. The response from command was skeptical at best. Resources were scarce. Every ton of material, every man-hour of labor, was desperately needed elsewhere. Why waste it on theater? Reinhardt's answer was mathematical. A bombing raid on this bridge will involve approximately 20 aircraft, 40 crew members, 18 tons of ordnance, and the fuel for a 6-hour mission. If we can draw even one such raid away from the real bridge, we've saved more resources than we spent building the decoy. If we draw 5 raids, we've won a significant operational victory without firing a shot. The logic was difficult to argue with. Reluctantly, the project was approved. Reinhardt was given 6 weeks, a construction crew of 60 men, mostly older engineers and laborers deemed unfit for frontline service, and access to a timber yard that had been supplying materials for fortifications. They started building in late January, working primarily at night to avoid observation. The construction was a masterclass in theatrical engineering. Reinhardt approached it not as a military project but as a design problem. The question wasn't, how do we build a bridge? But, how do we build something that looks like a bridge from 4 miles up? The foundation was simple: wooden pilings driven into the riverbank, arranged in the same pattern as the real bridge's concrete supports. From ground level they looked obviously fake. But from 20,000 feet, filtered through a camera lens and atmospheric haze, they had the same visual footprint. The span itself was constructed from timber beams, cross-braced for stability but hollow in the center. The entire structure weighed less than a tenth of what an actual steel bridge would weigh. It could support foot traffic and light vehicles but nothing more. That didn't matter. It only needed to be photographed. The crucial element was the surface detail. Reinhardt had his crew paint the wooden beams with a mixture of graphite powder and oil, creating a dark metallic sheen that resembled weathered steel. Canvas sheets, stretched tight and painted with false shadows and rivets, covered sections of the span. From above, the texture read as industrial construction. Rail approaches were simulated using gravel beds and carefully positioned wooden ties. Actual tracks weren't necessary, just the visual suggestion of rails leading to and from the bridge. Again, the goal wasn't to deceive someone standing on the structure. It was to deceive someone looking at a photograph taken from 4 miles away. But Reinhardt's most clever innovation involved the context around the bridge. He had his crew build false anti-aircraft positions nearby, obvious circular earthworks with dummy guns, positioned exactly where a defender would place them to protect a valuable target. He arranged supply crates near the approaches. He even had small fires lit periodically near the bridge, creating smoke plumes that suggested industrial activity. Every detail reinforced the same message: this is important. This is real. This is worth attacking. The real bridge, meanwhile, was subjected to the opposite treatment. Its approaches were camouflaged with nets and painted canvas. Smoke generators were positioned to obscure it during typical reconnaissance flight times. Anti-aircraft positions were moved to create the impression that defenses were lighter than they actually were. The psychological trick was subtle. Make the real target look less valuable than it was, while making the fake target look more valuable. Reinhardt understood something fundamental about human perception. We don't see what's there. We see what we expect to see. And what we look for is what stands out. Create something that stands out in exactly the right way, and you can make it impossible for observers to notice what you actually want to hide. The first reconnaissance flights passed over in mid-February. Reinhardt and his crew watched from a concealed observation post, holding their breath as the aircraft circled overhead. The photographs would take days to develop and analyze. There was no immediate feedback. But internal intelligence reports began filtering back within a week. Allied command had identified a bridge near Wesel as a high-priority target. Coordinates matched the decoy's location. Reinhardt allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. The illusion was working. What he couldn't have known was the chain of analysis happening inside Allied headquarters. Intelligence officers studied the photographs with meticulous care. They measured shadow angles to confirm the bridge's height. They traced rail lines to verify its connectivity. They counted what appeared to be defensive positions and supply depots. Everything confirmed what they expected. A critical railway crossing, well defended, actively used. The kind of target that justified a major bombing mission. The raid was scheduled for March 13th. Weather conditions were favorable. The bomber group assigned to the mission, the 390th Bomb Group, flying out of England, had experience with bridge targets. Their bombardiers had trained specifically on hitting narrow infrastructure targets. This would be a textbook operation. On the morning of the 13th, Reinhardt received word through military channels that Allied air activity was increasing. He ordered his skeleton crew to evacuate the area around the decoy bridge. Then he waited. The sound reached them first. A low rumble that built gradually into a thunderous roar. 18 B-17 flying fortresses, arranged in tight formation, approaching from the west. The morning sun glinted off their aluminum fuselages. At 22,000 feet, they looked like silver crosses against the blue sky. Reinhardt watched through binoculars from a position 2 kilometers away. He felt something strange in that moment, not quite pride but a kind of awful anticipation. He'd spent his career creating illusions meant to delight audiences. Now he was creating one meant to waste destruction. The bombers began their run. Even from this distance he could see the bomb bay doors opening. Dark shapes began falling, tumbling through the air in precise sequence. The bombardier's skill was evident. The bombs were clustered tight, aimed directly at the center span of the decoy bridge. Then impact. The explosions were enormous. Geysers of water erupted from the Rhine. Timber splintered with cracks that sounded like rifle fire. The canvas coverings tore away in flaming sheets. Secondary explosions, carefully placed by Reinhardt's team using small demolition charges, added to the spectacle, creating the impression of fuel stores or ammunition detonating. Within 90 seconds the decoy bridge was gone. Completely obliterated. Nothing remained but shattered pilings and debris floating in the current. It looked exactly like a successful strike on a strategic target. The bombers circled once, their crews photographing the damage for post-mission analysis. Then they turned west and headed home. Mission accomplished. Bridge destroyed. Reports would note excellent bombing accuracy and complete destruction of target. Reinhardt lowered his binoculars. 300 meters downstream, hidden by morning fog and camouflage netting, the real bridge stood untouched. A train was scheduled to cross in 2 hours. It would do so without incident. The Allies didn't discover the deception immediately. Why would they? The photographs showed a destroyed bridge. Mission reports confirmed direct hits. Intelligence assessments noted that rail traffic through the region had indeed been disrupted, though that disruption was actually caused by other factors, including fuel shortages and partisan activity. It wasn't until ground forces reached the area in early April that the truth became apparent. Forward reconnaissance units found the remains of the decoy bridge and quickly realized something was wrong. The debris was too light. The construction too crude. And 300 meters away, a fully intact railway bridge was still operating. The embarrassment was significant but quiet. After-action reports noted the incident as an intelligence oversight and misidentification of target. Recommendations were made about improving photographic analysis and increasing reconnaissance flight frequency. But in the larger context of a war that was clearly ending, it was a footnote. For the Germans, however, the success was meaningful. The real bridge continued operating for another 3 weeks, allowing the evacuation of thousands of troops and civilians eastward before Allied forces finally captured it intact. Those 3 weeks represented countless supply runs, reinforcement movements, and humanitarian evacuations that wouldn't have been possible if the bridge had been destroyed in March. Reinhardt himself survived the war. He returned to Munich in late 1945 and resumed his career as a theatrical designer. He rarely spoke about his engineering work during the war, and the bridge project remained classified in German military records until the 1970s. When historians finally interviewed him in 1982, he was an elderly man living in a small apartment filled with sketches and models. Asked whether he was proud of the deception, he gave a careful answer: "I'm proud that fewer people died because of something I built. In war, that's rare." The story of the decoy bridge reveals something essential about modern conflict: the importance of the information environment. Every military operation exists in two spaces simultaneously. There's the physical battlefield, terrain, weapons, logistics. And there's the cognitive battlefield, perception, belief, decision-making. The Allies had overwhelming advantages in the physical space. More aircraft, better bombs, superior navigation technology. But they were vulnerable in the cognitive space because their decision-making depended on accurate perception. They needed to identify the right targets. And identification depends on distinguishing the real from the fake. Reinhardt exploited that dependency by understanding what Allied intelligence officers were looking for. They wanted to find bridges. They wanted to find strategic targets. They wanted to believe that their reconnaissance flights were producing actionable intelligence. So he gave them what they wanted: a target that looked perfect, that confirmed their expectations, that appeared exactly as a valuable bridge should appear. The brilliance wasn't in the construction quality. It was in the psychological design. Every element of the decoy was engineered to trigger recognition. The defensive positions said, "This is important enough to defend." The supply dumps said, "This is actively used." The positioning said, "This is strategically located." Each detail added credibility, building a coherent picture that made sense to analysts looking at photographs. And once that picture was established, contradictory evidence was easily dismissed. If someone questioned whether the bridge looked quite right, others could point to all the confirming details. Collective analysis produced collective confidence. The deception worked not by fooling any single person, but by creating a consensus that was difficult to challenge. This principle extends far beyond World War II bridges. It's the foundation of modern camouflage and concealment doctrine. It's why stealth technology focuses not just on being invisible, but on controlling what radar systems perceive. It's why cyber operations often succeed by creating plausible false data rather than trying to hide entirely. The lesson is uncomfortable. Our most sophisticated detection systems can be defeated not by better hiding but by better lying. By creating false positives that look exactly like what we're searching for. There's a philosophical dimension to this that's worth considering. What does it mean that destruction can be redirected by belief? That thousands of pounds of explosives, delivered with mathematical precision by highly trained crews using advanced technology, can be wasted on a target that exists only as an illusion? It suggests that certainty is a vulnerability. The more confident we are that we've identified something correctly, the less likely we are to question that identification. And that confidence can be engineered by someone who understands what we're looking for. This has implications beyond warfare. It speaks to how we process information in any high-stakes environment. How doctors diagnose diseases. How investigators solve crimes. How analysts assess intelligence. We're all looking for patterns, trying to distinguish signal from noise. And we're all vulnerable to well-constructed false signals that match our expectations. The counter to this isn't perfect detection. That's impossible. The counter is epistemic humility, the recognition that what we perceive might not be what exists. That confidence should be provisional. That even our best evidence might be pointing us towards something that was designed to be found. Reinhardt understood this intuitively. He wasn't smarter than the Allied intelligence officers who analyzed those photographs. He just understood the theatrical principle that audiences see what the stage tells them to see. And war, in many ways, is the most consequential theater. After the war, aerial reconnaissance and photographic analysis evolved significantly. Stereoscopic imaging allowed analysts to judge depth and scale more accurately. Infrared photography could detect heat signatures that revealed activity. Eventually, satellite imagery provided resolution sharp enough to identify specific vehicle types. But each technological advance was met with corresponding advances in deception. Decoys became more sophisticated. Camouflage adapted to new detection methods. The arms race between perception and deception continued. Because the fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. Military operations still depend on knowing where the enemy is, what assets they have, and what they're doing. That knowledge comes from observation. And observation can be manipulated by anyone willing to invest resources in creating convincing illusions. The economics of deception favor the deceiver. Building a fake bridge cost the Germans a fraction of what it cost the Allies to bomb it. The resources wasted on the attack, fuel, ordnance, aircraft where crew time, far exceeded the resources invested in the deception. Even if only one raid was diverted, the exchange ratio was favorable. This economic logic explains why deception remains central to military planning. Fake radio traffic, inflatable vehicles, mock airfields, computer-generated electronic signatures. Every modern military maintains deception capabilities because they offer asymmetric advantages. Small investments can redirect enormous enemy resources. But the bridge story also reveals something more subtle: the psychological burden of deception on both sides. For the Allies, discovering they'd been fooled created doubt about other intelligence assessments. If they were wrong about this bridge, what else might they be wrong about? That uncertainty degraded operational confidence. For Reinhardt and his crew, there was the strange isolation of knowing something the enemy didn't. Watching bombers destroy your creation while the real target survived. The satisfaction was private, almost secret. There were no medals for building fake bridges. No public recognition. Just the quiet knowledge that you'd successfully lied on a strategic scale. The bridge near Wesel was finally destroyed by ground forces in April 1945. Advancing American troops reached it, confirmed it was real rather than another decoy, and demolished it with conventional explosives to prevent any further German use. By that point, the war was in its final weeks. The bridge's destruction was tactically insignificant. But the decoy's success remained strategically meaningful. It represented a small victory in a losing war, a reminder that creativity and understanding of human psychology could still create military advantages even when material resources were scarce. Today, nothing remains of either bridge. The real one was rebuilt after the war as part of reconstruction efforts, then eventually replaced with a modern crossing. The decoy's remains were cleared from the river in the late 1940s. The site is unmarked. Most people driving across the current bridge have no idea that two earlier versions existed, or that one of them was designed to be destroyed. That anonymity is appropriate. Deception works best when it remains invisible even after it succeeds. When the enemy never fully understands what happened. When historical records are incomplete or classified. When the story becomes a footnote that most military historians overlook. But for those who study the invisible weapons of war, the tools of perception, misdirection, and psychological manipulation, the bridge that wasn't there remains a perfect case study. It demonstrates that the most effective defense isn't always the strongest fortification. Sometimes it's just making the enemy look somewhere else. Klaus Reinhardt died in 1991 at the age of 84. Among his papers, historians found detailed sketches of the decoy bridge, along with notes about other deception projects he proposed but never executed. One sketch showed a fake oil refinery designed to draw bombing raids away from a real fuel depot. Another outlined a mock airfield with wooden aircraft arranged in perfect formation. Most interesting was a journal entry from March 1945, written the night after the decoy bridge was bombed. It reads in part, "Today I watched my work destroyed. This should have been devastating, to see weeks of effort obliterated in 90 seconds. Instead I felt relief, because the destruction meant the illusion worked. The audience believed. And in war, a believed illusion is worth more than any physical structure. I wonder if this is what artists feel when their work is experienced as intended. Not pride exactly, but satisfaction that the communication succeeded. That what was meant to be perceived was perceived. That intention became reality in someone else's mind. The difference, of course, is that my art kills no one. In fact, it may have saved lives. Both the soldiers who would have died defending the real bridge if it had been attacked, and the bomber crews who would have faced our anti-aircraft fire. This is the strangest satisfaction I've ever experienced. To be glad my creation was destroyed. To find meaning in successful deception. War makes philosophers of engineers and liars of artists. I'm not sure which is sadder. That reflection captures something essential about the moral complexity of deception in warfare. Reinhardt wasn't celebrating violence. He was relieved that his work had prevented violence, or at least redirected it away from living people toward an inanimate illusion. There's a paradox there. The most ethical military deception is the one that causes the enemy to waste destructive effort on targets that can't be hurt. The fake bridge couldn't die. The bombers that attacked it returned safely home. The deception succeeded without creating casualties on either side. Contrast this with active combat, where success means destroying enemy forces. Where victory requires death. The bridge operation was a rare case where both sides could walk away, one believing they'd achieved their objective, the other having actually achieved theirs. A zero-sum game that produced no sum. This might be the ultimate lesson of invisible weapons. That the most sophisticated form of warfare is convincing the enemy that conflict has occurred when it hasn't. That victory has been achieved when it's been denied. That reality is something other than what it is. The bridge that wasn't there won because everyone believed it was. In the decades since World War II, military deception has become both more sophisticated and more necessary. Satellite surveillance makes hiding physical assets increasingly difficult. But the same technology creates new opportunities for deception because it generates vast amounts of data that must be interpreted by human analysts. And human analysts still see what they expect to see. Modern militaries deploy inflatable tanks that fool thermal imaging. Electronic warfare systems create false radar signatures. Cyber operations plant misleading data in enemy information systems. The principle remains unchanged. Make the enemy perceive something that isn't real and they'll waste resources responding to it. But there's also a defensive dimension that Reinhardt's story illustrates. Deception isn't just about fooling the enemy. It's about protecting what's real. By drawing attention to the fake bridge, he concealed the real one. By making one target obvious, he made another invisible. This is the essence of camouflage, not making something disappear but making something else appear more important. Misdirection rather than concealment. The magician's art applied to strategy. And like magic, successful military deception requires understanding your audience. What do they believe? What are they looking for? What will they accept as real? The better you understand how they perceive the world, the easier it is to manipulate that perception. Reinhardt succeeded because he understood how Allied photo analysts worked. He knew they were looking for bridges. He knew they measured shadows and traced rail lines. He knew they looked for defensive positions and supply dumps as confirming evidence. So he gave them exactly what their methodology would validate. The deception was tailored to the detection system. That's the key insight. You don't create a generic fake. You create a fake that will be interpreted as real by the specific way your enemy gathers and analyzes information. This principle has become more important as information systems have become more automated. Algorithms can be fooled just like humans, perhaps more easily because they lack intuition and context. Feed a machine learning system false training data, and it will produce false conclusions with perfect confidence. The battlefield of perception is now partly digital. But the fundamental dynamic remains: what you believe shapes how you act. And belief can be engineered by anyone who understands your decision-making process. The wooden bridge near Basel was never meant to last. It was designed to be destroyed. That was its purpose. And in its destruction, it achieved something no physical structure could achieve. It protected something more valuable by offering itself as a sacrifice. There's almost a poetic logic to that. The fake dying so the real could live. The illusion absorbing violence meant for substance. In a war where so much real infrastructure was destroyed, where so many real bridges were obliterated along with the people crossing them, this fake bridge served as a kind of shield. Not through strength but through substitution. This might be the most profound implication of invisible weapons. That they don't match force with force. They sidestep the entire logic of violent competition. They win by making the enemy's strength irrelevant, by turning precision into waste, by converting capability into confusion. The B-17s that bombed the decoy bridge were extraordinary machines. The crews were skilled. The bombs were powerful. But all that capability achieved nothing because it was directed at a target that didn't matter. The weapon was perfect. The intelligence was wrong. And in modern warfare, wrong intelligence defeats perfect weapons. This is why information has become as important as ammunition. Why cyber operations can achieve strategic effects that conventional weapons cannot. Why propaganda and psychological warfare are taken as seriously as air defense and artillery. Because shaping what the enemy believes shapes what they do. And what they do determines whether they win or lose. Reinhardt grasped this intuitively. He didn't try to shoot down the bombers. He didn't build stronger bridges. He just built a convincing lie and let the enemy destroy it. And in doing so, he achieved a defensive victory without firing a shot. If there's a final lesson in this story, it's about the nature of reality in conflict. We like to think of war as a contest of physical facts. Who has more tanks, more planes, more soldiers? But war is also a contest of perceived facts. What does the enemy believe about our strength, our location, our intentions? The bridge near Basel proves that perceived facts can matter more than physical facts. The Allies believed they destroyed a critical bridge. That belief shaped their subsequent operations, their strategic planning, their allocation of resources. The belief was false, but its effects were real. This creates a disorienting possibility that the most important battles might be happening in spaces we can't see. in the gap between what is and what is believed, in the difference between the map and the territory, in the divergence between data and reality. Reinhardt exploited that gap with wood and canvas. Today's military planners exploit it with electrons and algorithms. But the principle endures: control perception and you control decision. Control decision and you control outcome. The wooden bridge was mocked before it was built. Then it was bombed. Then it was forgotten. But in between those moments, it changed the strategic calculus of a major river crossing and bought time that translated into lives saved and operations sustained. Not bad for something that wasn't really there.